As I mentioned at the end of the last video, the priority for this month was to work on the AI/enemy system for this game. So I decided to start making a swinging mechanic just so you really felt like Spider-Man. No excuses, I just did it because I felt like it. Mostly I thought the game needed a little bit more movement variety. The best way I can describe why movement variety is necessary would be any obstacle-less environment in a Metroidvania game. Often these games will have passages that make it easier for the player to cross large portions of the map in a short amount of time, but they end up feeling a bit boring, especially if the game has no run/dash mechanic. Take this section from Blasphemous. From a mechanics point of view, this is one of the most convenient routes for the player to take, but it ends up being more frustrating to go through as there are no interactable objects or enemies. Let's take a similar room from the same game that serves the same purpose, but instead has a row of easy enemies that with an unconventional attack pattern that's simple but substantial enough to force the player to focus. Not only can this room be done relatively quickly on a repeat playthrough, but can net the player some extra pocket souls. I felt my game didn't need a dash mechanic, but given that the flame and the lamp have a chain between them, this mechanic sits a little better with the game's world, as well as introducing a movement mechanic which requires the player's focus to successfully use. So you might be asking how this works. It's pretty simple actually. I draw a ray between the flame and the lamp. If that ray hits a hook object, then that judges the distance and the angle that the ray is coming at. Then the start point is judged by the angle, and the distance is also fed into the calculation. This information then gets put into a unit circle vector 2 method. Then based on the direction between the player and the hook, the player will move in the direction corresponding. It's probably worth mentioning now the core of the level design in the game. I find a lot of puzzle games tend to be quite dry. Each level is self-contained and in its own box, often only having players revisit old levels for a gold star. So I thought I'd use the open-ended design of a Metroidvania style game that allows for revisiting old areas with new abilities to give the player a greater satisfaction of reconquering an old area with new skills. Plus, it gives the player a sense of being more big brain when they come back and solve the puzzle much quicker. Including the tutorial area and the central hub, I intend to have 4 core areas. Each of these areas will have the first third introduce a set of object related mechanics. So for instance, a firewood zone, a forest zone, an ice zone, and a wind zone. Again, these aren't finished products, but more just general ideas. At the end of that third, the player will be introduced to a new lantern. The next second third will give the player the opportunity to learn about the mechanics of that lantern. After that section, the player gains the ability to spawn that lantern when possessing a torch, which also resets the level as well. For the final section of that zone, the player will need access to all of the lamps from each of the areas. So there'll be puzzles that naturally block the player from getting past without having all of the lanterns. For instance, as an idea, having a space that's too small for a normal sized lantern to get through, but that the small lantern can make their way through. This means that the player will have to repeat puzzles to get back to the last third of each zone. So the movement mechanics will be very important. Also, other lamps should help make it easier for the player to skip or make puzzles much easier. This is why I implemented a new lantern. This is the floating lantern. It lets the player slow their descent when holding the space button. However, it cannot move horizontally when grounded, so the player has to jump to move left or right, or even just move at all. The floating lantern is also raised by the updraft of burning objects, which basically allows them to sustain airtime for longer. Bearing in mind that we want the player to be able to change the environment using multiple lanterns, and I've added this swinging mechanic. I made it so that when the player's flame transfers from one lantern to another, it leaves the floating lanterns deactive and can be used as a swinging hook point. This means that not only does the player have a new way to move if they want to, but also allows the player to skip certain challenges that they've already completed. This also further emphasises the idea of making it so that lanterns can help each other piggyback along like Lost Vikings. The possible issue with this is that the players might be able to skip new puzzles that teach new mechanics, leading to the players to be confused later on when they have to use that mechanic, but they don't understand it because they've skipped the puzzle. Now to eventually get onto the enemies. The reason this took a while was that I wanted to make it so that there was a generic parent script for the AI that I wouldn't have to repeat myself in every script I make. So most of the basic AI stuff is the same. Put simply, the main difference between an AI and a player character is that the player character has the player as the decision-making method. The AI instead uses stimuli and state machines to choose what action it takes. If you give the AI the wrong information, then the decisions it makes will be correct, but not what you want. For instance, I wanted the Cloud Dragon to follow the player and attack them when they were in range. I only needed to judge distance along the x-axis, as that was really the only area that the Cloud Dragon could actually move. If I just judged the distance, which is the vector 2, then when the y-axis was too far away, the attack would never trigger. And if the y-axis was too close, then the attack would trigger too early and not near where the player was. So the easiest way to do this was to alter the information that I was feeding to the AI, opposed to changing the way it made its decisions. So just as a summary of what I did with the AI, I added the Cloud Dragon, and that works as basically intended. The cloud will follow the player or any flame object, and it will actually go towards the flame objects first, so the player can use it as a distraction, and then it will rain down upon them. And basically it has exactly 8 individual points, and it will just judge each of them. So that's what gives it that kind of like effect that looks like it's dropping on top and stopping, and then there's like a spread, opposed to what would have happened if it was just one large 1 unit block, which would have basically made it stop in midair and look a bit weird. This makes it look a little bit more natural. And effectively this acts as like a vertical problem for the player to solve, because often it's just jumping or similar to that, whereas now there's a pressure from above to move or perhaps hide underneath something. Also, I spent a lot of time doing the twisty bit, which I was very proud of, but then I realised no one could actually see. The second enemy I made, which I'm even more proud of the visuals for, is the food dog. And the food dog was actually relatively a good idea. The most interesting thing about the food dog for me is that it changes the player's interaction upon meeting them. So initially the player will be running away from the food dog, trying to keep their distance, trying to keep things in between them, perhaps even tricking them using the flame source. But the second that the food dog gets close enough, it's able to actually steal the flame source. And this means that it actually has a light so it can be seen, whereas prior to this it can't actually be seen because it doesn't have a fire source in it. So it's hidden and the players should be trying to avoid it. But the second it gains the flame object, or at least it gains the flame that the player has, the player now either has to go back to a flame source that it can relight like a torch, or it needs to chase down the food dog, which is now more visible because of the flame. But instead of what it was doing before, where effectively the player was running away, now the player is actively chasing the food dog. Now the food dog is actively trying to run away. The player can set things in place if they're not lit. So for instance, if the player isn't lit at all, the food dog won't interact with them. So the player could theoretically unlight themselves, set up a trap for it, set themselves back a light, move out, have the food dog steal the light, trap it, and then make its way across. Also, in the example that I made, I also made it clear that the player could actually just use the food dog as a means of jumping over an obstacle. I also like the idea that the food dog could unintentionally, or at least for itself, steal the player's flame, set a bunch of objects that the player wanted to set alight without any consequences to the player. The player can then just casually relight themselves and let the food dog deal with the consequences, perhaps of going across a burning bridge or setting a bunch of other enemies alight. So, in the interest of not getting distracted further, like with the swinging hook problem, I've decided to make myself a list of things I want to get completed by the beginning of next month. Effectively, by that point, I want the player to be able to possess a torch, which will allow them to reset the level. I want them to be able to spawn lanterns specifically, and with this, I'm basically imagining the shrine of the torch, having several nodes around it of the different lanterns that the player can spawn, and that the lantern can hover over, and it actually places it there so the player can see it. And the idea being that the player could move around that circle and spawn different ones to see what they wanted to do, and then leave that menu and then come and possess that lantern that's left out for them. There are 2 puzzle elements that I want to have implemented, and that's the metal box and the light lens / mirror. Someone suggested the metal box before and I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it, but I realised that most of this game so far has been focused on fire, which is fair, that's kind of like the core aspect of it. But both light and heat aren't really interested in or don't have mechanics or objects in the environment that are really well affected. With the exception of ice, heat has no functionality. So I decided to make the metal box, and the metal box will basically function like a normal box, but it will have the trait that when the player gets near it and has the heat source on it, the metal box will start to increase in heat, effectively glow in and eventually becoming its own heat source. This can then be used to melt ice or other things in the future, I'm not too sure. But with the intent of this being that it's an object that only has heat. There's no ignition and the effects might be slower. They won't be destroying the object, but they might just make the object slowly decay in heat. The light and lens mirror is actually a little bit more interesting because light also doesn't have functionality. In fact, it has the least functionality in the game at this point, because it doesn't even have a thing that's based on it. I thought that if almost all of the objects in the environment have a certain trait where they will allow the player to offset one of the aspects of the flame. So the metal boxes and the wooden boxes, effectively these allow the traits of the player to be transferred to another object and allow the player to not have to deal with the problem directly. The light mirror is kind of meant to do this for light. So when the player comes close within the light range, it will actually cause that mirror to reflect light off in a direction. And then if the player goes behind it, they should be able to twist certain light sources and stuff like that. I intend to kind of do a similar system to Gato Robo, where the cat could actually like twist a little treadmill, it can make things function. I think that'd be quite interesting for the lamp, where it'll kind of stand on a treadmill and kind of use it to turn a light source to solve a light puzzle, which would be a little bit different from what the puzzles I have so far. I also want to add a plant object, and that would be an object that grows when it's met with light, so the player would have to stand in a certain place to grow an object out. And I think that you could have different stages for that plant object as well. So for instance, it could grow and be a positive effect, like allow the player to jump on top of it, but it could also be an enemy type which would grow and try and kill the player. Or for instance, an enemy type that would start out very small but follow the player as a light source, and as it gets more light, becomes stronger and stronger and stronger and more of a nuisance for the player. Another mechanic I want to add is the lantern stacking, and this was kind of an idea based on the previous ones, where I wanted the player to be able to kind of collect as many lanterns as they wanted. The idea being that if the player could go through a level and make sure they had every single torch lit and use every torch's lantern and survive that entire ordeal without dying, then the player could keep all of those lanterns as an advantage for the next puzzle, and to a certain extent it would allow the player to better control all of their lanterns at once, because I imagine there's going to be quite a few lanterns for the player to control, and if they can quickly hot them on top so that they can move to the next room without having to constantly like bunny hop over each other, I think that it might be a little bit more convenient of a solution. Two other extra things I want to add, and these are kind of like low priority. I want to have a save and load system, which is going to be connected to the torch possession stuff that allow the level to reset. But this also means that when the application closes and then is reopened, the player can then re-enter a save and then be able to start off from where they left off, because obviously it's a Metroidvania and it's a puzzle game and people don't want to lose their progress. And as previously mentioned before, if it's a Castlevania style game, I'm going to need some kind of mini-map. I'm not sure how I'm going to do it, as I don't want it to take up too much of the screen space, as I'm kind of happy with like the minimal UI I have at the moment. And I need to think of how I'm functionally going to be able to do it, because obviously the rooms aren't specifically structured to be a certain size at the moment. So that is something I'm going to have to look at. I'm going to see if I can copy someone else's. I mean, borrow someone else's method. I'm not sure if I'm going to do this by simply just having a big collider be the way of checking if a room's been done, or I'm going to be a little bit more smart with it and just have it so that it's like a certain location bounds, or even smarter, of which I have no idea what that could be.